Guardians of the Galaxy hit GameStop shelves last month, and no, not like that. But, good try? Within about 2 weeks, I'd played through it twice and I'd platinumed it, so clearly I enjoyed myself. I thought the game was pretty funny at times, I thought it had pretty great pacing, solid voice acting, incredible visuals, almost flawless performance, top-notch lip-syncing and facial animations, heaps of writing, a pretty great story, and fun action that mixed a couple of genres fairly well. It faltered a little bit at the end to be sure, with a shoehorned-in final boss and a really painfully awkward and unfinished final celebration, but other than that, I thought the game was pretty awesome. So what gives with this title then? When my brother and I watched the original reveals of Guardians of the Galaxy, we walked away insanely confused. We both thought there were some really cool, promising things in there, but they were mixed with some horrible, really rough-looking key elements. And by the time we watched the PlayStation Showcase trailer for it, I remember telling him immediately after, yo, Eidos Montreal needs to fire anyone that's not on their art direction team. Obviously that's a bit of a hyperbole, but my point is that I felt like the art team was on a completely different game. The game's visual design was so standout and gorgeous, and everything else was falling so flat in the trailers, it almost felt like a waste. Like damn, I feel bad for the people who worked so hard on the visuals, cause this game is gonna be panned on release and it's not their fault. And as a side note here, I think it's criminal that this game wasn't nominated for art direction at the Game Awards. I think it should have won, even over Psychonauts and Kena, but to not even be nominated? Come on. Imagine my surprise, however, when I woke up one day to a bunch of publications and prominent YouTube reviewers enjoying the hell out of this game, giving it good scores, strongly recommending it, calling it well crafted and funny. It almost felt like they were talking about a different game than I'd been seeing in trailers, and I came to a brand new conclusion. Yo, Eidos Montreal needs to fire whoever made these trailers. I think Guardians of the Galaxy was saved a little bit by releasing at a time when nothing else was coming out, because it made people like me, who were very down on the game since its reveal a few months back, do a full 180 once the reviews came out and actually buy the game. But if they had released anywhere close to another game that I was gonna sink money into, it would have been left in the dust. A lot of people need to prepare for and plan out their purchases for stuff like this. That was an unintentional tongue twister. And if you market yourself so poorly that a massive Marvel fan and a massive video game fan like myself didn't even remember or care it was coming out till like a day prior, even if your game is amazing, you've screwed yourself now, because people are gonna have a hard time flipping on a dime about a $60 purchase. $80 here in Canada. I wouldn't be surprised if the game didn't hit pre-reveal expectations, even though it was pretty well liked. It shot itself in the foot before release. And what I want to do today is explore the many facets of Guardians of the Galaxy, how they came out in the final product, and how their marketing absolutely let them down. I have a bit of a theory, a game theory, about Guardians of the Galaxy that I'm not sure is true, but it would explain something that I found a little bit off about the game. I think that because of COVID, there were restrictions here on how many people could be in scenes together during filming, aka when there's a scene with all of the Guardians, they actually weren't all on set at the same time or even had CG stand-ins. Maybe some of them were, maybe the more humanoid characters, but I wouldn't be surprised if they shot these scenes one person at a time, because while I think the actual writing is quite solid in the game, the timing is all off. Every time there's a casual exchange between characters, there's like this brief pause in between the back and forth. It's not very long, but it feels very unnatural. It seems less like the characters are talking to each other and more like these are individual line deliveries that are stitched together, and this changes all the time. For example, sometimes lines that are in direct response to another character's question will overlap a little bit in a way that also makes them feel arbitrarily placed next to each other, although usually that's in exploration moments where giving characters individual voice lines to deliver in a booth or something makes a bit more sense, but still, the timing, especially the comedic timing, is all wonky in this game, and whether that's from COVID or just weird directing, what this kinda does is make the humor really inconsistent and very reliant on the actual words being said rather than relying on timing. Still, overall, I think it's forgivable, and I think the game is funny even through its more rough jokes, because it had enough moments that made me chuckle, whether through one-liners or contextual humor or what have you, and if I'm being honest, that's pretty rare for video games. There are a few series that have always kinda knocked it out of the park with humor, but overall, I think a lot of games that think they're funny really aren't. What absolutely baffles me though is that with all the solid jokes and goofy scenarios, how was it that you showed like 20 minutes of the game between all of your trailers and not a single good punchline made made it through. That might have happened accidentally, much less if your job is specifically to try and show people some funny parts of the game. If you've seen trailers for Guardians of the Galaxy but haven't played it, or if you maybe picked some choices that didn't lead to this, let me give you an example of the critical failure that the trailers were in terms of showcasing the writing and specifically the humor of this game. At one point in the PlayStation Showcase trailer, it does that thing that everyone loves. We all truly love this. Please keep doing this movie and game trailers. It always works. Where all the epic music cuts out and there's this awkward drawn out joke and you go haha, and then the music continues and it's epic again. Ah, love that. It wasn't annoying in every trailer it's in, that's for sure. The joke here though was somehow even more painfully awkward than all of the other trailers that do this. In the middle of this grand over the top speech, Star-Lord starts grabbing his chest and saying he's having a heart attack, and then the bad guy goes, "Grr, stop that," and he says fine, and that's it. Yay. It was such a weird clip, because the performance here from Peter's actor, John McLaren, felt so flat, and it seemed like the joke was gonna go somewhere at least slightly more interesting. Like maybe he'd throw in a clip about, I don't know, the speech going on so long he started dying of boredom. Would have still been 700 pounds of suck as a joke, but at least there would have been some more semblance of an attempt, you know? It was a bad joke, a bad attempt to mock the villain, and it did the opposite job it was supposed to do. It convinced me that this game thought it was funny when it absolutely was not. But do you want to hear the kicker to this whole story? This isn't actually a joke in the main game. The context for this clip is that the Guardians need to distract Raker from seeing Rocket tinker with the thingamajig behind him, so they try and keep him talking and looking in their direction, and they're failing at this miserably. Star-Lord's final attempt, which was something that Rocket suggested and Peter laughed at a few minutes ago, is to fake a heart attack. Not to mock him or be quirky or whatever, just to be a pathetic final attempt to keep the attention on Peter, and he really didn't want to do it, so his heart clearly isn't into the performance. In the game, it's a completely normal clip, and I like that section, but the trailer tried to entirely recontextualize it and change it into something else. It's like the people who made this trailer didn't even watch the scene it was a part of. You can't play this as your big laugh in your trailer when it's not even a joke. You make the whole game look so much worse, and it sets the tone for people to poke more fun at other lines because they believe the game's humor is garbage. There's a clip later on in this trailer of Peter saying, yeah, it seems like they were drinking funky juice or something, which like is again not really a joke, it's just a slightly goofy way of saying people are crazy. It's not really meant to make you laugh, it's just the lighthearted way Peter talks, but because of what you did here, it makes people inclined to believe that this line was also a horrible attempt at making us laugh. There's a compounding effect that goes on. You start looking for bad lines and picking everything apart because the most obvious examples of what were shown to you convince you that this was something worth making fun of. Guardians of the Galaxy is a densely packed game in terms of writing, perhaps one of the densest ever. And I'll admit there are times where it gets overly cheesy and on the nose, and times where the humor just isn't hitting, but I think considering how much needed to be written for this game, its ratio of good to bad lines, funny ones, angry ones, chill ones, everything in between, is pretty solid, but you wouldn't know that watching the promos. Even worse, somehow though, has to be how poorly the gameplay was sold to us. Guardians had a bit of a weird rollout. It was announced pretty close to launch compared to a ton of other games of this scale, but weirder yet was that it debuted with like 4 different trailers all at once in one conference. I have no idea what was going on there. The trailer or showcase I want to focus on for this section is the longer gameplay reveal showcase, because most of the other trailers just featured back-to-back 1 to 2 second clips of combat that didn't help you get a good sense of how it plays. Trailers like this always make the game seem cooler than it is, just look at any Battlefield or Call of Duty trailer, so this longer gameplay reveal is the best place to focus, and my god, talk about underselling. I think the one cool thing that was shown here was the dialogue options. There were a couple decisions that looked like they'd have ramifications, and that idea seemed pretty interesting for a Guardians game. And I wanted to note here, by the way, that I did really enjoy this in the final game. My brother and I made a few different decisions when we played, and when we talked about it, we noted some of the differences, and it was pretty cool how some of them affected certain things. Although I do think it's disappointing that it didn't lead to multiple endings. Aside from this though, the actual combat we were seeing in the trailer was rough looking, starting with performance. Now, this actually isn't the fault of the trailers, to be fair. They showed the game how it was running, and I appreciate them keeping it true to the performance of the current build, even though it showed some sloppy performance, instead of trying to re-record this section over and over until they could reduce stuttering. Either that, or they did record this over and over and this was the best they could do, which yikes, but still, even though the trailer wasn't exactly doing something wrong here, I gotta point this out because the showcase showed the game chugging at some points. Like, look at this. I'm not slowing this down or altering it at all. This is what was shown to us the first day this game was revealed. I'm actually astonished that they were able to stabilize this so well in just a few months. It's really impressive. While that was an unfortunate consequence of circumstance though, I need to take the next little bit to rip into the poor decisions made in terms of what to show off here. First off, these are your worst, most boring looking jello cube textureless demogorgon basic stupid looking ass enemies in the whole game. They are there as the most basic of basic enemies mainly for the tutorial, and if Eidos Montreal approached me and said, hey, what enemies do you think we should showcase in our trailers? I would have said, I have no clue, but really anyone but these two. I get that you only want to show some early stuff from the game here in your trailers, but fast forward a little bit and you can still get some action scenes that aren't spoilers that have less laughable enemies than this. I don't mind these enemies being in the game. They're not great, but I mean, whatever, they're mainly just in the intro. But you made them the poster children of your enemies by showcasing them like this. I assumed all of your combat would be against enemies as stupid looking and boring to fight as these ones because you put them on a pedestal like this. Even though the other trailers showed you fighting more acceptable foes, throughout the entire marketing, the only enemies I could remember were the Jello Cube and the Demodog that looked unfinished. This game doesn't have great enemies, some really solid looking boss designs, yes, but not a whole ton of memorable looking regular enemies. But these are the only two that you actively laugh at, and somehow they were the ones that you chose to show off. Also, it's really odd to me that they'd show us the worst type of combat scenarios in the entire game, a low number of boring enemies with a decent sized health bar. There are a lot of encounters in this game, and I'd say that fights against a smaller number of decently powerful and interesting looking enemies are solid. Fights against a large number of fodder enemies aren't super engaging, but it's fun to blow them up in rapid succession. Fights against one massive boss are pretty fun, and the game is at its best when it's a whole mix of powerful and less powerful enemies in large numbers that you need to take down, which is also, by the way, the most frequent type of encounter. That is 4 different types of combat scenarios that are all massively more enjoyable than the few times the game forces you to do these types of fights. This is the weakest part of the combat, and again, for whatever reason, I guess to keep the reveal to a section as early as possible, this is what we were shown. I had so many combat encounters in this game where I was flying around, blowing dudes up, commanding the Guardians really fast, setting up fun attacks like using Rocket to squish a bunch of enemies together and then getting Gamora to slice through them all, or sending people upwards with Groot and then outwards with Rocket's grenade, or ripping through massive health bars with Gamora and Drax's incredibly focused attacks. And yet somehow all that was shown here was a boring, empty, open arena with an incredibly low number of lame enemies and abilities being thrown out at random. I'm not that great at games, I'll be the first to admit, but when my brother was watching me play through this one, even in the first couple of chapters, half the time he'd say, wow, you're doing a much better job of showing how fun this game's combat is than the trailer people did, and all I can do is agree with him. This game is fun to play. How'd you make it look so boring? I'm fully convinced that the one good part of these trailers, the showcasing of the visuals, was done entirely by accident, considering how aggressively horrible the other elements of the trailer were. You're always gonna catch heat in games like these for making characters look different from their live action counterparts. I think the original Spider-Man PS4 face is one of the only ones to avoid that, and it's because we've already seen multiple versions of Spidey in mainstream films. It's dumb, and I wish people realized that, hey, comic characters have changed their looks more often than they change their clothes, sometimes literally, but whatever, it is what it is. The locations and special effects really stood out though in these trailers. You either had vibrant or bustling areas, or environments built up of materials that seemed unique and alien, or both. And that means that you're kind of just seeing interesting visuals at all times. I mean, personally, I don't love the Noodle Planet's color palette, it feels a little bit too dull, but also to me, it's known as the Noodle Planet. It has at least a distinct look to it, and it's not ugly. It's still very unique, and the fact that it's one of my least favorite looking areas in the game says a lot about how this game looks. The reason I say that showcasing this was basically by mistake though is because the game never takes its foot off the gas in this department. The trailers could have shown any part of the game that wasn't a small corridor and it would have looked amazing. These trailers somehow skirted around good lines and fun combat encounters, but if they tried to do that with the visuals, it would have just shown you a couple dark hallways and that's it. And I think that's the best description of how this game looks and why I think it's pretty worth it for the visual design alone. The Guardians of the Galaxy trailers were one of the biggest disservices to a game I've ever seen. Let me be clear, this is not a perfect game. There's a few things that I really don't love. There's sometimes too much dialogue and it gets tiring, some final encounters run a bit long, like I said, sometimes it's cheesy and sometimes it's awkward, but while those feel like small missteps within an overall package that typically doesn't possess those less desirable qualities, the trailers place those things front and center as the core tenets of the game. I feel like I've never had this kind of turnaround around on a game pre and post launch. I've had games that I thought would be good and ended up being less so, but I've never thought that something looked awful only for it to come out and be one of my absolute favorite experiences of the entire year. As happy as I am it ended up garnering appreciation, it deserved way better than the truly disastrous rollout it received.